Chicago, the early 20th century, a city that never slept, yet had never truly known peace. Cold, stone-paved streets lay shrouded in the morning fog. The distant roar of trains carried the half-formed dreams of immigrants, still struggling to take shape. Skyscrapers rose as symbols of American ambition, but at their feet lurked shadows, places where law and morality slowly blurred. In 1920, the United States enacted Prohibition, a decision born of moral idealism, yet one that inadvertently opened the door to an unprecedented era of crime. Alcohol vanished from legal shelves, but it never disappeared from human life. It merely changed its hiding place, descending into basements, behind locked doors, inside secret bars known as speakeasies. Chicago became the center of that thirst, a thirst for alcohol, a thirst for money, a thirst for power. Here, police officers carried not only badges, but thick envelopes. Politicians campaigned not just with promises, but with paid silence. Ordinary citizens lived between two worlds by day, obeying the law. By night, stepping into the shadows in search of a drink, a moment of forgetfulness, a fleeting sense of freedom. This city did not give birth to monsters. It created the conditions for them to grow. Within this landscape, a new generation of men emerged. They wore no uniforms, held no titles, yet controlled entire neighborhoods with a single glance. Their power did not come from the law, but from fear and loyalty purchased with cash. Chicago became a vast chessboard. Every street was a move. Every wrong decision was paid for in blood, and amid the chaos, fate was quietly selecting a name. Not the smartest man, not the most ruthless, but the one who understood best how power truly worked in a society at war with its own ideals. Al Capone had not yet appeared on the front pages, but Chicago was ready for him, because when the law retreats, the strong step forward. And when a city loses its moral compass, it forges its own legends. This is not merely the story of a crime boss. It is the story of a city, an era, and the price America paid for ideals it could not control. And this is where it all begins. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was not born into luxury, but into the noise of a poor neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York in 1899. It was a crowded world where families were crammed into dark apartments, where the smell of cheap bread mixed with sweat and coal smoke. Capone's father was a barber, an immigrant from Italy. His mother was a devout woman who devoted her life to holding the family together in a foreign society. They came to America with a simple belief that hard work would earn their children a better future. But early 20th century Brooklyn was no promised land. It was a place where dreams were often crushed before they had a chance to grow. All grew up among children who were forced to mature too quickly. On the streets, rules were not written on paper, but with fists. Every walk to school was a test. Every street corner was a lesson in survival. The strong lived. The weak did not. The boy Capone was not lacking in intelligence, but he lacked patience, and he lacked submission. School did not teach him how to survive. The streets did. When Al was 14, a confrontation with a teacher brought his education to an abrupt end. That blow was more than an act of violence. It was a declaration. Al Capone walked out of the classroom and straight into a world with no way back. Brooklyn at the time was crawling with street gangs. For poor immigrant children, they offered more than money. They offered belonging. In a society that treated them as outsiders, gangs gave them identity, protection, and a small but intoxicating sense of power. Al adapted quickly. He learned how to observe, how to stay silent when necessary, and how to strike when there was no other choice. His earliest scars were not only etched into flesh, but carved deep into his mind. They taught him that the world was unfair, and that justice usually stood with those who held power. One night, while working at a small bar, Al insulted a young woman. Her brother responded with a knife. 3 long scars were slashed across Al's face, leaving marks that would never fade. Scarface was born that night, though Al would despise the nickname for the rest of his life. Yet the scars became a symbol. They told the world that this boy had survived. In the damp alleys of Brooklyn, Al Capone learned the most important lesson of all. Respect is not asked for, it is taken. And if the law does not protect you, then you must create your own. The family was still there. His mother still prayed every night. His father still cut hair for familiar customers with little money. But the distance between Al and ordinary life grew wider each day. He no longer believed that honest labor could lift him out of poverty. He believed in speed, in opportunity, in strength. Brooklyn did not create a villain. It created a man who adapted to brutal circumstances. A boy forced to choose between weakness and ruthlessness. And Al Capone chose the path he believed was the only way to survive. This is where everything begins. Not with dreams of ruling Chicago, but with an immigrant boy raised in poverty, learning how to survive in a world that showed no mercy. Al Capone's fate did not fall from the sky. It was forged day by day on the cold streets of Brooklyn. In the violent world of Brooklyn, it was not the strongest who survived the longest, but those who knew how to think before they struck. Al Capone realized this early when he encountered a man entirely different from the loud street toughs that filled the neighborhoods. His name was Johnny Torrio. Torrio was not tall. He did not talk much. He did not boast of past victories. Yet whenever he appeared, even the most hard-headed men knew to listen. There was something unsettling about his calm, as if he had already seen the outcome of every conflict before it began. To Al Capone, Torrio was more than an acquaintance. He was a doorway into an entirely new world, a world where crime was not chaos, but order, not emotion, but calculation. Torrio taught Capone that violence was a tool of last resort, that guns were expensive, noisy, and attracted unnecessary attention. True power, he said, came from money, silence, and relationships built at the right moment. In late-night conversations, Torrio spoke to Capone about organizing territory, dividing profits, and bribing the right people. He did not call it crime. He called it business. To Torrio, the underworld functioned like any other market. There was supply and demand, competition, monopoly, and above all, rules. Those who broke the rules were removed. Capone listened. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. In the eyes of the young man, something more than raw aggression appeared for the first time. It was understanding. Capone understood that if he wanted to escape poverty, if he wanted control over his own fate, he had to think like an operator, not like a reckless thug. Torrio, in turn, saw in Capone what others missed, not just strength, but loyalty. Capone did not betray. He did not talk too much. He did not act without permission. In a world where treachery was the norm, such qualities were worth more than gold. Their relationship was quiet. There were no dramatic vows. But day by day, Torrio was shaping Capone, teaching him how to restrain his anger, how to smile when necessary, and how true power did not need to be displayed. It was Torrio who first spoke to Capone about Chicago, a city on the brink of explosion, a place where Prohibition was about to become a goldmine for those smart enough and cold enough to exploit it. Brooklyn taught Capone how to survive. Johnny Torrio taught Capone how to rule. From that moment on, Al Capone's path was no longer that of a street brawler. It became the path of a man learning how to build an empire using his mind before his fists. Capone's destiny was no longer a question of if. It was only a question of when. In 1920, the United States entered an unprecedented moral experiment. Prohibition officially took effect. On paper, alcohol was erased from legal life. In reality, it merely vanished from daylight. Alcohol was no longer poured in elegant bars. It flowed instead through basements, windowless rooms, behind doors that were always locked. Americans did not stop drinking. They simply learned how to drink in silence. For the working class, alcohol was an escape after long, exhausting days. For the elite, it was a habit they could not abandon. And for the underworld, it was a golden opportunity. Prohibition did not make people more moral. It made morality expensive. Demand did not disappear. It increased. And wherever there is demand, there will always be someone willing to supply it. Chicago became the center of this storm. An industrial city where cash moved faster than the law. A place whose docks, railroads, and warehouses formed a perfect network for smuggling liquor. A city where a crate of alcohol could travel from Canada to a dinner table in a matter of days, if you knew the right name to call. To men like Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, this was not crime. It was a market. A vast, unregulated market waiting for someone bold enough to seize it. They saw what the government did not. When the law tries to force people to live against their nature, a vacuum of power appears. And that vacuum is always filled. Speakeasies sprang up like mushrooms after rain. By day, they were barbershops, bakeries, clothing stores. By night, they transformed into another world. Jazz music filled the air. Laughter blended with the sharp scent of liquor. In those cramped rooms, people forgot the crisis, forgot morality, forgot the law. The police knew. The politicians knew. But they drank too. And when envelopes were placed in the right hands, silence became a shared agreement. Prohibition unintentionally handed power to those willing to break the law with organization, not reckless criminals, the men who knew how to calculate, how to invest, how to expand networks. Al Capone stood at the center of this moment like someone who had been preparing all his life. The lessons of Brooklyn, the philosophy of Johnny Torrio, everything converged into an opportunity that came only once. Alcohol became liquid gold. Violence became a cost of operation. Silence became the most valuable asset of all. The underworld was no longer a fringe society. It began to seep into the very center of everyday life. And when ordinary citizens stepped into secret bars each night, they did not realize they were feeding the rise of a new empire. Prohibition was created to save America. Instead, it gave birth to crime bosses who would change the nation's history forever. And for Al Capone, the door of destiny had opened. Now the question was no longer whether he would step through it, but how far he would go. When Al Capone arrived in Chicago, he did not come as an invader. He came as an observer. The city was louder than Brooklyn, more ambitious, and more dangerous, but it was also more open to those who knew how to wait for the right moment. Chicago in the early 1920s was a city swelling at the seams. Factories rose. Workers poured in. Cash circulated daily. And alongside it all was a thirst for alcohol that could never be satisfied. In the shadows of Prohibition, Chicago became a promised land for the underworld. Johnny Torrio had built the foundation. But Al Capone was the one who turned that foundation into an empire. Capone did not rule through meaningless terror. He organized. He structured. He transformed scattered gangs into a smoothly operating system. Everyone had a role. Every route was controlled. Every bottle carried profit. Bootlegging operations ran day and night in abandoned industrial districts. Alcohol moved by truck, by boat, by rail. From Canada southward, from the outskirts into the city's core. The network was so vast that it became difficult to tell where legality ended and crime began. Capone understood one essential truth. To rule Chicago, violence alone was not enough. He needed silent consent. He needed police officers to look away. He needed politicians to remain quiet. And he was willing to pay for that silence. Cash-filled envelopes changed hands behind closed doors. Private dinners took place after working hours. The law slowly became a decorative shell, while real power flowed beneath the table. To the public, Capone appeared as a successful businessman. He wore tailored suits. He smiled for cameras. He donated to the poor. To many Chicagoans, Capone was not a criminal. He was an employer, a man who kept the bars open, someone who helped them forget the hardships of everyday life. But behind that smile was an iron hand. Those who refused to cooperate understood the consequences. No threats were necessary. An accident, a smashed storefront, a name that quietly disappeared from the city. Capone's order was maintained through collective silence. When Johnny Torrio survived an assassination attempt and chose to step aside, Chicago did not descend into chaos. Capone stepped forward. No struggle, no declaration. He simply took over. In his late 20s, Al Capone became the most powerful man in Chicago. A city of millions. An underground economy worth tens of millions of dollars a year. And a system in which every road led back to a single name. But with power came isolation. Capone trusted no one completely. Every meeting carried suspicion. Every handshake could conceal a blade. He lived among crowds, yet belonged to none of them. Chicago gave Capone everything he had ever dreamed of: money, fame, absolute power. But it also began to demand something in return, something no one could hold forever. Because when one man controls an entire city through bootleg liquor and fear, sooner or later, the light will find him. And for Al Capone, the empire he had just built was also the shadow slowly closing in around him. As Al Capone's empire grew, it could no longer survive on bootleg liquor and gunfire alone. To control a city like Chicago required more than that. It required the silence of those entrusted with upholding the law. Corruption did not arrive all at once. It crept in through small steps. An envelope placed on a desk. An inspection quietly postponed. A report that was never filed. And before long, silence became habit. For many Chicago police officers of the era, their salaries were not enough to support their families. They lived in the same struggling neighborhoods as the men Capone employed. When forced to choose between abstract morality and putting dinner on the table, many lowered their heads. Capone understood this better than anyone. He did not view the police as enemies. He saw them as part of a system to be managed not through immediate threats, but through dependence. Officers who accepted protection money began to see Chicago differently. They knew which bars to avoid, which trucks not to stop, when to turn away so they would not see what they did not want to see. Politicians were not immune to the pull. Local elections required funding. Campaigns needed cash. And Capone was always ready to help so long as that help was repaid through timely decisions. Laws were written, but their enforcement was negotiated. Anti-bootlegging bills were delayed. Investigations slowed. Files disappeared into desk drawers. The people of Chicago felt it, even if they could not always name it. They knew some stood above the law. They knew justice was no longer blind. It was looking in the direction of money. In this atmosphere, the line between right and wrong blurred. A police officer still kissed his children before leaving for work, then spent the night guarding a shipment of illegal liquor. A politician still spoke of public morality, then signed decisions that benefited the underworld. Capone did not need to be everywhere. He was present through the system itself, through nods of agreement, through unrecorded phone calls, through people who convinced themselves they had no other choice. Chicago slowly became a city living two lives. By day, it obeyed the law. By night, it operated under Capone's rules. The two worlds existed side by side, without collision, without questions. But this compromise came at a cost. Each time an officer looked away, a piece of public trust shattered. Each time a politician remained silent, the city's moral foundation weakened. Capone did not just buy people. He bought time. He bought delay. He bought the space his empire needed to grow stronger every day. Yet when a city allows silence to become an unwritten law, sooner or later that very silence turns into a scream that cannot be silenced. And Chicago was moving dangerously close to that moment. When Al Capone's empire reached its peak, his life entered an entirely different world. Gone were the cramped alleys of Brooklyn. Gone were the dark rooms reeking of cheap liquor. Capone now lived amid a luxury that had once existed only in the imagination of a poor immigrant boy. Grand hotels, parties that lasted until dawn, jazz music floating through laughter and ever-full glasses. Capone stood at the center of it all, tailored suits, polished leather shoes, and the bearing of a man fully aware that all eyes were on him. To the public, Capone was not a monster. He was a celebrity. Newspapers printed his name. Cameras sought him out. He smiled, gave interviews, spoke lightly about business and life. He knew exactly how to say what people wanted to hear. Capone understood the power of image. In a city exhausted by economic hardship and rigid laws, he appeared as a symbol of abundance, a man who lived large, spent freely, and dared to challenge limits others were forced to accept. He donated to charities. He distributed food to the poor. To many people in Chicago, Capone did what the government could not. He gave them jobs. He gave them pleasure. And in a bleak era that carried a particular kind of power. But behind the spotlight, Capone's life was anything but peaceful. Luxury did not erase the constant tension. Every room was guarded, every journey carefully planned. He was rarely alone, yet never truly safe. As long nights drifted by amid music and hard liquor, Capone remained alert in his own way. He watched, he remembered. He always knew that public affection was fragile. One mistake, one incident too far, and everything could turn against him. His family was close, yet unable to reach that inner world. Capone did not share his fears. He did not admit exhaustion. For him, weakness was something that could not be allowed to exist. Capone's lavish life was a shell. It concealed the truth that he was living inside a gilded cage, beautiful, expansive, but with no exit. Chicago saw a generous, confident, powerful Al Capone. But inside that image was a man who understood that everything he possessed was built on unstable ground. And when you live long enough in blinding light, you forget that darkness is always just behind you, waiting for the lights to go out. The morning of February 14th, 1929. Chicago awoke to the biting cold of winter. The city prepared for Valentine's Day, a day meant for love, flowers, and gentle promises. But inside an old brick garage on North Clark Street, there were no flowers, no music, only the tense waiting of 7 men. They were enforcers of a rival gangmen who had lived too long in a world where death was always close. That morning, They believed they were about to receive a shipment of liquor, a routine deal, an ordinary day in the underworld. When the door opened, the men who entered wore police uniforms. In Chicago at the time, police were not something to fear. If anything, they brought a sense of reassurance. The men obeyed orders, facing the wall, hands raised. They did not know that this moment would be the last of their lives. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the empty brick walls. Not one shot, not two, but a storm of bullets. When silence returned, 7 bodies lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. Chicago stood still. Photographs spread across the nation collapsed bodies, blood not yet dry. The public recoiled as it became clear that underworld violence had crossed an invisible line. These were no longer secret killings in dark alleys. This was a public message code, deliberate, unmistakable. Al Capone was not in Chicago that day. He was in Florida. On paper, he had an alibi. But in the minds of the American public, that no longer mattered. No one doubted who stood behind the massacre. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became a symbol of something more frightening than crime itself. It revealed the level of power the underworld had achieved, the ability to impersonate the law, to kill in broad daylight, to challenge an entire nation. Yet amid the public outrage, one truth was rarely spoken. The men who died that day were not faceless names. They were sons, brothers, human beings who might have chosen differently, had life offered them another path. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre did not only kill 7 men. It killed the illusion that violence could be controlled. It exposed the true face of a system that had allowed power to fall into the hands of those accountable to no one. For Al Capone, the massacre marked the peak of his dominance, but it was also a moment of fate. From that point on, he was no longer merely a controversial figure. He became the embodiment of evil in the eyes of the American public. Chicago would never look at him the same way again. Neither would America. That day, love did not disappear from the city, but innocence did. And from the blood spilled on that concrete floor, the road to Al Capone's downfall began to come into focus clearer than ever before. After the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the first thing to disappear was not Al Capone's power. It was the public's tolerance. Chicago had once looked the other way. America had once treated Capone as a byproduct of Prohibition. But now, no one could pretend that everything was still under control. Newspapers changed their tone. Headlines no longer carried curiosity mixed with admiration. They carried outrage. Images of blood-soaked bodies were printed again and again, a relentless reminder that the price of silence had become too high. For ordinary citizens, a moral line had been crossed. They could accept bootleg liquor. They could accept quiet compromises. But they could not accept the cold-blooded execution of men in broad daylight, under the disguise of the law itself. Al Capone began to feel the shift in small details. Eyes that were no longer friendly. Handshakes that grew stiff. Greetings once filled with respect, now laced with fear and distance. On a national level, pressure mounted daily. Politicians could no longer evade responsibility. Public opinion demanded action. The press named Capone not as a local crime boss, but as a threat to the order of the United States. Capone, who had once carefully controlled his public image, was losing control of the narrative. He was no longer a symbol of wealth or generosity. He became the face of decay of a system that had gone too far. Yet what was striking was that Capone did not panic. He was angry. He felt betrayed. In his mind, he had only done what the city itself had accepted for years. He could not understand why everything had suddenly changed. Isolation began to close in. Those who once laughed beside him now kept a safe distance. In Capone's world, loyalty had never been free, and when the cost became too high, many chose to walk away. America needed a symbol onto which it could pour its anger. And Al Capone, too powerful, too famous, became the perfect choice. From that moment on, he was no longer facing only rival gangs. He was facing an entire nation demanding the return of a sense of justice it believed had been lost. And when a society decides to turn its back on someone it once tolerated, collapse becomes only a matter of time. When America decided it could no longer look away, it needed a new face, someone unbought, unbound by Chicago, young enough to believe in the law and hard enough not to bow to the power of the underworld. That is how Elliot Ness entered the story. Ness was not a hero lifted from legend. He was a young government agent of ordinary background, carrying an almost naive belief that the law still mattered. In a city where everything had a price, Ness brought with him the rarest commodity of all: integrity. When Ness arrived in Chicago, he quickly realized that his enemy was not only Al Capone. The true enemy was an entire system that had grown comfortable with compromise. Every investigation leaked. Every plan was dismantled before it could begin. Instead of retreating, Ness chose a more dangerous path. He built a small team made up only of men he trusted completely, not because they were the most skilled, but because they had not yet been bent. The press would later call them the untouchables men, who could not be reached with money. Taking on Capone was unlike any investigation before. Ness understood that he could not attack image or reputation. Capone was immune to that. He had to strike at the foundation: cash flow, supply lines, the bootlegging operations that functioned in silence. Every raid was a gamble, not just with careers, but with lives. Threats arrived regularly. Watchful eyes followed openly. Ness knew that a single mistake could bring everything to an end. On the other side, Capone observed it all with a mix of contempt and curiosity. He did not see Ness as a real threat. In his mind, no one could fight an entire system armed only with honesty, but that assumption slowed him down. Capone was not used to men who refused money, not used to men who had nothing to lose. The confrontation between Ness and Capone was not fought with shootouts in the streets. It unfolded in paperwork, in ledgers, in quiet raids. On one side stood power accumulated over years. On the other stood patience and an unyielding belief in the rule of law. Ness endured immense pressure. The press watched closely. Superiors doubted him. The public demanded results. Every failure was magnified. Yet he continued not for fame, but because he believed that if Capone was not stopped, then no one ever would be. The untouchables did not bring down Capone's empire overnight, but they introduced something he had never faced before: a wall that could not be bribed. A reminder that power does not always win. And for the first time in many years, Al Capone felt something unfamiliar, not fear, but unease. The hunt had begun, and the outcome was no longer entirely in his hands. Al Capone had lived outside the law for many years. Blood had been spilled. Money had flowed. Yet what ultimately brought him down did not come from gunfire, nor from the massacres that had shaken the nation. It came from numbers. When every other path to prosecution reached a dead end, the U.S. government chose a strategy that seemed almost mundane: taxes. No one stood above the obligation to pay taxes. Not even the most powerful man in Chicago. To Capone, it was an insult. He mocked the idea. In his world, cash required no paperwork. Income required no explanation. Power protected itself. But federal law was more patient than he expected. Accountants, investigators, people who carried no guns and never appeared in headlines. Quietly, they pieced together the financial portrait of an underground empire built on concealment. Every lavish expense, every house, every trip, every expensive suit, all of it became evidence. There was no need to prove whom Capone had killed, only to prove that he had earned money and failed to report it. In the courtroom, Capone was no longer a kingpin. He was a defendant. There were no loyal crowds, no fear to serve as a shield, only lawyers, a judge, and cold numbers. Capone tried to maintain his composure, but observers noticed the difference. For the first time, he did not control the room. He could not buy the jury. He could not delay indefinitely. When the verdict was delivered, there were no gunshots, no riots, only a heavy silence. Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion 11 years in federal prison. For many, it was an unsatisfying ending. A man responsible for so much suffering convicted of something that seemed small. But for the law, it was a crucial victory. It proved that even when violence goes unpunished, the system can still find a way to close the net. Capone left the courtroom no longer an untouchable symbol. He was a man left behind by the very era he had helped define. His empire still existed, but without its leader. This victory did not belong to a single man or a single investigative team. It belonged to the idea that the law, slow and imperfect as it may be, can still prevail if it does not give up. For Al Capone, the game was over. Not in the way he had imagined, but in the way history chose. And ahead of him, there were no lights, no power. Only cold walls waiting in silence. Alcatraz was not built to imprison men. It was built to imprison power. When Al Capone set foot on the cold, rocky island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, everything had changed. There was no Chicago, no jazz music, no fearful glances. Only sea wind, stone walls, and a heavy silence. At Alcatraz, there were no privileges, no envelopes, no quiet deals. The guards did not know Capone's name, or if they did not care. Here, every prisoner was the same. A number, a uniform, an iron bed. For Capone, it was the greatest shock of his life. He had once given orders, decided the fate of others with a single nod. Now he stood in lines, followed schedules, remained silent when told. The walls of Alcatraz were not only physically cold, they were mentally cold. Each day passed exactly like the one before. No news, no schemes, no future left to calculate. Capone tried to adapt. He played the banjo in the prison band. He took on small tasks. But nothing could hide the truth. He was no longer himself. In Chicago, Capone lived among crowds, always alert. In Alcatraz, he lived among crowds, completely alone. No one feared him. No one needed him, and no one listened. It was in that silence that illness began to surface. Conditions from his past, long ignored during years of luxury, now had nowhere to hide. Capone's memory faded. His focus dissolved. Episodes of confusion arrived without warning. The man who once controlled an entire city now struggled with the simplest acts, reading a page, following a conversation, remembering a specific day. Alcatraz did not beat Capone. It did not torture him. It did something more cruel. It forced him to face himself, stripped of every layer of power. During long nights, as the sea wind screamed through iron bars, Capone no longer thought about his empire. He thought about Brooklyn, about childhood, about his earliest choices, about the road that had led him here. Alcatraz did not offer Capone redemption. It offered him a slow ending, a quiet, unheroic unraveling. Because in this place, power meant nothing. Fame held no value. And when everything is taken away, a man is left with only himself. For Al Capone, that was the harshest sentence of all. It was not prison that defeated Al Capone. It was his own body and mind. The years at Alcatraz did not pass in violence or rebellion. They passed in quiet decline, a deterioration invisible at first, yet impossible to reverse. The illness Capone had carried since his youth, long ignored amid power and parties, began to demand its payment. Lingering headaches, moments of disorientation, gaps in memory that appeared with growing frequency. At first, Capone tried to hide it, as he always had with every weakness. But at Alcatraz, there was nowhere to run. No lieutenants to cover for him. No packed schedule to drown out the truth. He began to forget names, dates, words he had spoken only moments before. The man who once memorized every street in Chicago now struggled to follow a simple conversation. The most painful part was not the loss of memory, but the rare moments when it returned, when Capone realized who he had once been and where he now was. Those brief flashes of clarity cut like a slow blade. Doctors noted a clear mental deterioration. Capone could no longer focus, no longer reason with complexity. The sharp mind that once ran an empire dimmed, like a light nearing extinction. The guards no longer watched him with caution. They watched him with pity. Capone was no longer a threat. He was a patient. During long hours of isolation, Capone often muttered to himself old names, vanished places. Brooklyn, Chicago, family. Fragments of memory drifting without connection, no longer forming a story. Mental decline stripped away the last thing prison had not yet taken, self-awareness. Capone slowly lost the ability to understand who he was, what he had done, and why his life had ended this way. There was no grand tragedy, no final confession. Only a man aging too quickly, trapped inside a body and mind that no longer obeyed him. Illness accomplished what no rival ever could. It made Al Capone harmless, not through force, but through forgetting. And in that unraveling, the question was no longer whether he deserved it. The question became something far more human. What remains when memory disappears and power becomes nothing more than a distant name? When Al Capone left prison, there was no crowd waiting, no cameras, no fear or reverence that had once surrounded him. The man who stepped into the light that day was no longer the boss of Chicago. He was only a thin shadow of the past. Capone returned to Florida, far from the city that had once celebrated him and then cast him aside. A quiet mansion, warm sunlight, blue sea on the surface, a perfect setting for the final years of life. But for Capone, that quiet was not peace. It was emptiness. He lived among family, yet no longer truly connected. Conversations broke apart. Questions were repeated. Important memories vanished, while trivial details surfaced briefly, then dissolved. Capone no longer cared about the news. He did not ask about Chicago. He did not speak of the empire that had once terrified the nation. It was as if his mind had closed a chapter his body could no longer read. Those who had once feared him now looked at him with sadness, not for what he had done, but for what he had lost. Power, no matter how great, cannot protect a person from the fragility of time. Capone spent long hours sitting in silence, staring at the sea, staring into nothing. Some days he was lucid, aware of who he once was. Other days he was completely lost, like an aged child abandoned inside his own life. There was no more violence, no ambition, only the slow repetition of days without purpose. For a man who had lived by control, this was the deepest punishment of all. Al Capone did not die as a legend. He faded as a human being, quietly, without drama, without glory. His life closed in a bitter paradox. The man who once controlled the fate of thousands could not control himself. The man who once made an entire city bow ended in obscurity. Capone after prison was no longer a symbol of crime or power. He became a quiet reminder that no empire survives when the human being inside it collapses. And when everything had passed, what remained was not fear, but a deeply human emptiness. Al Capone died in the quiet of an afternoon in Florida. There was no crowd, no spotlight, no curses or praise. Only family, a few close relatives, and a body worn out after too many years spent fighting itself. The man who once made America tremble passed away like an elderly patient. His memory had abandoned him long before. In his final days, Capone no longer recognized the world around him. He did not remember Chicago. He did not remember power. He did not even remember the enemies who had once kept him awake at night. Death came without drama, but not gently either. It felt like the inevitable end of a life that had burned too much energy on control and violence. When his heart stopped, what remained was not a crime boss, but a human being who had lived too fast, too fiercely. News of Capone's death spread, then quickly faded. America had already moved into a different era, new fears, new enemies. Capone became a name from the past. But his legacy did not disappear. Al Capone was not only a criminal. He was a product of his time, of Prohibition, of immigrant poverty, of a society where the law had not yet caught up with human ambition. He forced America to confront its own cracks. He made authorities realize that violence could not be tolerated simply because it was wrapped in money. He helped reshape how the law would confront organized crime. In popular culture, Capone has been retold in many forms: villain, symbol, legend. But beneath all of that, the true story remains a deeply human tragedy. An immigrant child raised in poverty. A young man who chose the fastest path to respect. A man who paid the price with his memory and his very self. Al Capone's legacy does not lie in the money he made or the lives he indirectly destroyed. It lies in a quiet warning that power built without humanity will collapse on its own, and that no empire is stronger than time or the human body. When the story closes, Al Capone is no longer a boss. He is a chapter of history, dark, complex, and impossible to erase. A quiet death. A noisy legacy, and a lesson that echoes long after.